Hello again, everybody. Welcome to part 4 of our Chapter 10 lecture series. This section is entitled The Age of Jackson. The focus question for this section is, in what ways did Andrew Jackson embody the contradictions of democratic nationalism? As we had begun discussing in the last section of this lecture series, by the time of Jackson's election, politics had become an integral part of American culture and Americans' daily lives. Jackson, Van Buren, and the Democrats initiated a new and much more robust party system in American politics. Jackson introduced a new policy known as the spoils system, which made party identification even more significant to Americans. The spoils system was a policy that support for a particular party or for a particular candidate, especially monetary support, would lead to appointments to government jobs and positions for those who showed that support. And again, this sort of spoils system greatly enhanced the significance of party politics and the potential for advancement in society and politics through that system. Adams and Clay formed a whole new party, the Whigs, in response to the emergence of Jackson's Democratic Party. And this really signaled the final end of that old Democratic-Republican Party. These two parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, divided over their stance towards banks, tariffs, currency, internal improvements, the balance of power between national, state, and local authorities, and the size and the scope of federal government. The Whigs were very much the liberal party in this period of American politics, while the Democrats were very much the conservative party in this period of American politics. This system, this new party system, however, was not quite as unifying as theorized by Van Buren. The Democrat stronghold was really typically in the South, while the Whig stronghold was in the North, particularly the Northeast, those old New England states. Although Democrats and Whigs existed, all over the country, in both the North and South, by and large, the South was predominantly Democrat, while the North was predominantly Whig during this period, further delineating and exacerbating those divisions between the two sections of the country in this period. Battles between Democrats and Whigs in this era, as well as the general differences in the mindset and worldviews between liberals and conservatives of this era, reflected a clash between public and private definitions of American freedom. According to Democrats, liberty was a private entitlement best secured by local authority and endangered by strong national government. Under Jackson, in general, the power of the national government declined. States gradually replaced the federal government as the country's main economic actors. The federal government backed off supporting new economic initiatives, and states stepped in to fill that void within their own borders. And this saw as a consequence, the emergence of growing disparities in development between rich and poor states, those states that could fund internal improvements and other economic initiatives, and poor states who were strapped for cash and could not so easily fund such projects, as well as between liberal and conservative states and their mindsets over the necessity of such projects even to begin with. These debates over issues of private and public freedom initiated new debates over the government's role in private affairs, especially when it came to issues of ethics and morality. Democrats considered individual morality a private matter and opposed moral legislation. They put forth that the government cannot force people into good morals and should therefore stay out of such matters. The Whigs, by contrast, claimed an activist national government could enhance freedom by creating the conditions for not only economic development, but social development as well. This included legislating morality for the quote-unquote greater good. Ironically, Jackson, much like his limited government forebears like Thomas Jefferson, found that once he attained the highest office in the land, expressing that federal power proved to be too tempting to pass up, especially when it pushed a particular agenda that he was after. So, again, ironically, Jackson's first term proved to be a battle to uphold the supremacy of federal law, something that was antithetical to the platform of his Democratic Party. And the real testing ground for this came because of what became known as the Tariff of Abominations. The South insisted that the tariffs that were put into place in the 1820s penalized Southern consumers in order to protect Northern manufacturers. And therefore, the South Carolina legislature threatened to nullify the law. Now, this was the first time that Jefferson's theory of state nullification was attempted. But it also must be kept in mind that behind South Carolina's economic motives for nullifications lay the fear that a strong national government could potentially take action against slavery at some point in the future. So therefore, states' rights must be protected in order to protect the institution of slavery. The South Carolina legislature's threat to nullify the Tariff of Abominations initiated the Nullification Crisis. Now, this whole idea of nullification strengthened the positions of states' rights among Democrats and provided a well-developed political philosophy that dominated Democratic politics until the Civil War. The Nullification Crisis in many ways presaged the same issues that later led to the Civil War itself. And in fact, South Carolina did also threaten to succeed in 1828 over this nullification crisis. Of course, Jackson was outraged by South Carolina's threats to nullify the tariff. He equated nullification with disunion itself. And as a result, he was able to get an act passed through Congress known as the Force Act, which gave Jackson the authority to use the military to enforce the tariff in South Carolina. Now, this was the first time the federal government assumed the authority to use military against the states themselves. Thankfully, the crisis was avoided by Henry Clay and South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, who got together and negotiated a compromise that avoided federal enforcement of the Force Act. And this compromise entailed a reduction of those tariff duties. Not an elimination of them, but a reduction to the point that basically appease the South Carolina legislature, and of course, coupled with the threat of military action, South Carolina backed down from its threats to nullify the Tariff of Abominations and to secede from the Union. Andrew Jackson was certainly no friend to the American Indian. He had spent much of his previous military career fighting Native Americans throughout the South and the West of the United States at that time. And in 1830, his government authorized the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, the impetus behind this was really initiated by the discovery of gold on Cherokee lands in Georgia. And as a result, Jackson felt it was necessary to remove all remaining Indians east of the Mississippi to open up all that land to white settlement once and for all. And in many ways, the Indian Removal Act was a repudiation of Jefferson's policy of civilization and assimilation of the Native Americans into the broader American society. The Cherokee, for their part, the most civilized of the southern Indian tribes that remained in the region, sued the government and actually took the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually ended up ruling in their favor. The court ruled that Indian nations were essentially sovereign entities in their own right in many regards, and the federal government had to deal with them as such, essentially making the Indian Removal Act unconstitutional. Jackson, for his part, refused to enforce the ruling and implemented the Removal Act anyway, essentially taking all power away from the judicial branch, as the executive branch is responsible for enforcing laws. But if the executive branch chooses not to enforce the legislature's laws or the judicial branch's decisions, they're basically null and void for all intents and purposes. Now, to show you how much the Cherokee had assumed and internalized this assimilation and policy of civilization, this picture right here shows a Cherokee man named Sequoyah, who was actually part Cherokee and part white, who invented an alphabet for the Cherokee language, and as a matter of fact helped to start the first Cherokee language newspaper in Cherokee territory in the early 19th century, as a way to prove to the broader American white culture that Native Americans too could be civilized, could be enlightened, could be educated. Sadly, those efforts fell on deaf ears, especially when it came to Andrew Jackson's natural sort of animosity toward Native Americans in general. Enforcement of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 initiated one of the darkest moments in American history, known as the Trail of Tears. Tens of thousands of Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and other smaller Indian groups were forced to march west overland to the newly established Oklahoma Territory, at that time known as Indian Territory. Territory west of the Mississippi that was part of that Louisiana Purchase that was not all that great, not all that fertile, and therefore deemed undesirable for white settlement, and therefore set aside for the Native Americans. Thousands of Native American people died en route to this Indian territory, thus giving this period the epithet of the Trail of Tears. Now, for their part, the Seminole Indians in Florida resisted removal and waged a 7-year-long war known as the Second Seminole War to try to avoid marching overland to the Indian Territory. Sadly, that war proved generally futile, but there was a small population of Seminoles who managed to evade federal capture and still remain to this day in southern Florida. Now, overall, Indian removal reinforced this new racial definition of American nationhood and freedom. Alright folks, that wraps up part 4 of our Chapter 10 lecture series, but don't go anywhere yet. Still one more part to go. Until then, study hard, and I'll see you soon.